The evening sky had turned a deep purple as Dr. Andre Chen pulled her silver Mercedes into the familiar streets of Oak Ridge Heights. Her shoulders ached after a 12-hour shift at Children's Memorial Hospital, where she'd successfully completed 2 emergency surgeries. All she could think about was getting home to a warm bath and her favorite chamomile tea. The rhythmic click of her turn signal was interrupted by the sudden flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Andre checked her speedometer. She'd been going exactly the speed limit. With a small sigh, she guided her car to the curb, making sure to stop under a bright street lamp. Following the protocol her husband had drilled into her countless times, she turned on her interior lights, placed both hands on the steering wheel, and waited. Through her side mirror, she watched the police officer approach. His footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and something about his stance made her grip the steering wheel a little tighter. The beam from his flashlight swept across her car, lingering on the hospital parking permit hanging from her rearview mirror. "License and registration," Officer Barrett demanded, not even bothering with a greeting. His voice carried an edge that made Andrea's medical training kick in, her mind automatically noting elevated cortisol levels, aggressive posturing, potential fight or flight response. "Good evening, officer," she replied calmly, keeping her hands visible. "My registration is in the glove compartment, and my license is in my purse on the passenger seat. Would you like me to get them now?" Barrett's response came sharp and quick. "You're awful polite for someone who doesn't belong in this neighborhood. How about you tell me what you're really doing here?" Andrea felt her heart rate quicken, but her voice remained steady. "I live here, officer. 1542 Oakwood Drive, just around the corner. I'm coming home from my shift at Children's Memorial. I'm a pediatric surgeon there." The flashlight beam hit her face directly, making her squint. "Right," Barrett scoffed. "And I'm the chief of surgery. Let me guess, you're here to visit a friend. Or maybe clean some houses." Through the glare, Andre could see a couple walking their dog slow down across the street, their phones now raised and recording. The husband had already pulled out his phone and appeared to be making a call. Good, witnesses were always good. "Officer Barrett," she said, reading his name tag, "I've had a very long day saving children's lives. I'm tired, and I'd like to get home to my family. If you'll allow me to reach for my documentation, I'll be happy to prove everything I've told you is true." "Step out of the vehicle," Barrett ordered, his hand moving to rest on his holster. "I don't believe that's necessary, officer," Andrea replied, her medical training helping her maintain composure even as adrenaline coursed through her system. "I'm happy to provide my license and registration right here." "I said, step out of the vehicle." Barrett's voice rose, echoing off the manicured lawns of Oak Ridge Heights. More lights were coming on in nearby houses now, more phones appearing in windows and doorways. Andrea's mind raced through her options. Her husband had taught her exactly what to do in situations like this. Slowly, she pressed the hands-free button on her steering wheel, activating her car's Bluetooth system. "Call home," she said clearly, keeping her eyes on Barrett. "What do you think you're doing?" Barrett demanded, rapping his knuckles against her window. "Exercising my rights as a citizen, officer," Andrea replied, her voice carrying the same calm authority she used in the operating room. "And making sure there's a record of this interaction." Little did Officer Barrett know that the man he'd soon be answering to was already on his way, and he wasn't coming alone. The next few minutes would transform a routine traffic stop into something that would change not just one police officer's career, but an entire department's approach to community policing. Through it all, Andrea kept her hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, just as her husband had taught her. She'd faced high-pressure situations in the operating room countless times. She could handle this one too. But as Barrett radioed for backup, she couldn't help but think about the irony. Here she was, being treated like a criminal, less than an hour after saving a child's life. More cars were slowing down now, more phones recording. The couple across the street hadn't moved, their dogs sitting patiently as they documented everything. Andre could see Barrett getting more agitated by the growing audience, his flashlight beam shaking slightly as he kept it trained on her. What Officer Barrett didn't realize was that his next few actions would not only be recorded by dozens of cameras, but would also be witnessed by someone with the power to make sure this kind of situation never happened again in Oak Ridge Heights. Help was already on the way, and with it, a lesson about assumptions that would resonate far beyond this quiet suburban street. Officer Barrett's backup arrived within minutes, 2 patrol cars pulling up with their lights flashing but sirens silent. The quiet neighborhood had become an impromptu stage, with the growing audience of neighbors trying to appear casual as they recorded everything on their phones. The evening air felt thick with tension. "Last warning," Barrett announced, his voice carrying across the well-manicured lawns. "Exit the vehicle now, or we'll have to remove you." His hand remained uncomfortably close to his holster, despite Andrea showing no signs of being a threat. The newly arrived officers approached more cautiously, taking in the scene. A well-dressed Asian woman in surgical scrubs, sitting calmly in an expensive car, surrounded by concerned neighbors. One of them, Officer Rodriguez, stepped forward with a puzzled expression. "What seems to be the problem here?" she asked, glancing between her colleague and Andrea. "Suspicious vehicle, suspicious behavior," Barrett replied tersely. "Subject refuses to exit the vehicle." Andrea kept her voice steady as she addressed Officer Rodriguez. "I'm Dr. Andre Chen. I live at 1542 Oakwood Drive, just around the corner. I'm coming home from my shift at Children's Memorial, where I'm chief of pediatric surgery. Officer Barrett pulled me over but won't tell me why, and I don't feel safe stepping out of my vehicle." Mrs. Thompson from across the street called out. "She's telling the truth. She's lived here for 3 years. Her husband's in law enforcement." Several other neighbors nodded in agreement, their phones still recording. Officer Rodriguez's expression shifted as she pieced things together. She stepped closer to Barrett, speaking in a lower voice that Andre could still hear. "James, I know this neighborhood. These people are vouching for her. Maybe we should." "I don't care if the whole neighborhood vouches for her," Barrett interrupted. "Protocol is protocol. She needs to exit the vehicle." Andre's car's Bluetooth system suddenly announced, "Call connected." A small smile touched her lips. Help was definitely on the way. "Dr. Chen," Officer Rodriguez tried again, adopting a more professional tone, "would you mind showing us your license and registration? We can start there." "Of course," Andre replied. "My license is in my purse on the passenger seat, and my registration is in the glove compartment. May I reach for them?" Before Rodriguez could respond, Barrett cut in. "Too late for that. You had your chance. Step out now, or we're doing this the hard way." The neighbors' murmurs grew louder. Someone mentioned calling the police chief. Mrs. Thompson was already on her phone, speaking rapidly to someone about that officer who's been causing problems. Andrea took a deep breath, drawing on the same calm she used during complicated surgeries. "Officer Barrett, I understand you're doing your job. But I'm doing mine too, following the safety protocols my husband taught me. I'm happy to show you my documentation. I'm happy to answer your questions, but I will not exit my vehicle without cause, especially given your current demeanor." Barrett's face reddened. "Your husband taught you? Let me guess, another one thinking they know more about police work than actual police." "Actually," Andre replied, checking her rearview mirror and spotting familiar headlights approaching, "he probably does." The sound of multiple vehicles approaching caught everyone's attention. 3 unmarked black SUVs turned onto the street, their government plates clearly visible in the evening light. They pulled up with practiced precision, boxing in the patrol cars. Barrett's hand finally dropped from his holster as he turned to face the new arrivals. The night was about to become much more interesting than a simple traffic stop. Officer Rodriguez had already taken several steps back, her experience telling her something big was about to happen. The neighbors had gone quiet, phones still recording as men and women in suits emerged from the SUVs. Through it all, Andre remained exactly as she had been, hands on the steering wheel, posture perfect, the picture of professional calm. She'd seen her husband at work enough times to know exactly what was about to unfold. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees as one particular suit approached, his badge already visible. Barrett's backup officers suddenly found fascinating things to look at in various directions, while Barrett himself stood frozen, finally beginning to realize that his routine traffic stop had somehow turned into something much, much bigger. The next few moments would not only change Barrett's career trajectory, but would spark a conversation about police conduct that would ripple through departments across the state. And it all started because he couldn't believe a successful doctor belonged in this neighborhood. The tension in the air shifted as a tall man in a crisp navy suit stepped out of the lead SUV. Special Agent David Chen moved with the quiet confidence of someone used to taking control of chaotic situations. His FBI badge caught the streetlight as he approached, flanked by 2 other agents. Back in the car, Andrea felt her shoulders relax slightly. She'd recognized the familiar sound of her husband's vehicles the moment they turned onto the street. The same vehicles their kids called Daddy's work cars were now lined up along the curb, their presence changing the entire dynamic of the scene. David had heard everything through the car's Bluetooth connection, every dismissive comment, every threat, every moment his wife had maintained her composure in the face of unwarranted aggression. He'd made the drive in record time, using those minutes to coordinate with both FBI colleagues and local police leadership. "Good evening." David's voice carried the weight of federal authority as he approached. "I'm Special Agent Chen with the FBI. Would someone like to explain why my wife is being harassed while coming home from saving children's lives?" Officer Barrett's face went through a remarkable series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, the dawning realization that he'd made a terrible mistake. "Sir, I was just conducting a routine traffic stop." "A routine traffic stop," David repeated, his tone making it clear he didn't believe that for a second. "And did this routine stop include a reason for pulling over a respected surgeon in her own neighborhood? Or was there another factor involved in your decision-making process?" The neighbors who had been recording everything moved closer, their phones still raised. Mrs. Thompson, who had been on the phone with the police chief's office, was now nodding with satisfaction. Her own daughter had been one of Dr. Chen's patients last year, the same Dr. Chen who was now being treated like a criminal. Officer Rodriguez stepped forward, trying to salvage the situation. "Agent Chen, I arrived as backup and was attempting to de-escalate." "I heard," David acknowledged, his tone softening slightly. "And I appreciate that, Officer Rodriguez. But I'd like to focus on the initial officer's actions." He turned back to Barrett. "You've been recorded threatening to forcibly remove my wife from her vehicle without probable cause. Care to explain that decision?" Barrett's voice had lost its earlier authority. "Sir, when a subject refuses to exit their vehicle—" "Dr. Chen," David corrected firmly. "My wife has a name and a title she's earned. And she was following standard safety protocols for traffic stops, protocols I personally taught her because I've seen too many situations go wrong." 2 more police vehicles arrived, this time senior department officials responding to calls from both concerned neighbors and the FBI. The street had become quite crowded, with the blue and red lights creating a surreal atmosphere in the usually quiet neighborhood. Andrea watched through her windshield as her husband professionally but firmly took control of the situation. She thought about all the times they'd discussed his work at the FBI, particularly his focus on civil rights violations and police accountability. Now those conversations were playing out in real time, right in front of their house. "Here's what's going to happen," David announced, addressing not just Barrett but all the officers present. "My wife is going to gather her license and registration, which she offered to show you multiple times. Officer Barrett, you're going to explain to your superiors and my colleagues exactly what prompted this stop. And then we're going to have a longer conversation about department policies and personal biases." The senior police officials who had just arrived were already requesting Barrett's body camera footage. Someone mentioned pulling dashcam videos from his previous stops to review for patterns. The quiet neighborhood had become the staging ground for what would clearly become a much larger investigation. Mrs. Thompson approached David, her phone still recording. "Agent Chen, this isn't the first time we've seen this officer profiling people in our neighborhood. Last month, he stopped the Robinsons' son 3 times in 1 week." David nodded, pulling out his card. "We'll need statements from everyone who's witnessed similar incidents. My team will be following up." He turned back to Andrea's car, his professional demeanor softening. "You can step out now, honey. I think Officer Barrett is done with his routine traffic stop." As Andrea finally stepped out of her car, several neighbors applauded. She moved to stand beside her husband, her surgical scrubs a stark contrast to his FBI suit. Together, they presented a powerful image, two professionals who had worked their way to the top of their fields, now standing united against the kind of prejudice that had no place in their community. The night was far from over, but the balance of power had shifted dramatically. What started as a biased traffic stop was about to become a catalyst for real change in the department. And it all began with one phone call home, a call that reminded everyone that justice sometimes arrives in unexpected ways. The neighborhood had transformed into an impromptu command center, with FBI agents and police officials creating a perimeter around the scene. Officer Barrett stood rigid, his earlier bravado completely evaporated as Special Agent Chen methodically laid out the series of mistakes that had led to this moment. "Let's review the sequence of events," David said, his voice carrying the weight of years of civil rights investigations. "You pulled over a vehicle in an upscale neighborhood without probable cause. You escalated a routine traffic stop despite the driver's full compliance. You threatened forcible removal when the driver, a respected medical professional, was following standard safety protocols. Captain Rivera, who had arrived from police headquarters, was reviewing the body camera footage on a tablet. Her expression grew darker with each passing moment. Officer Barrett, your camera reveals no traffic violation or suspicious activity that would warrant this stop. Would you care to explain your actual reason for pulling over Dr. Chen?" Barrett's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. I noticed the vehicle moving slowly through the neighborhood. At exactly the speed limit, Andrea interjected calmly, still standing beside her husband. "As I do every night when I return from the hospital, watching for children or animals that might run into the street." Mrs. Thompson and several other neighbors had gathered nearby, providing their own statements to FBI agents. Their phones contained videos not just from tonight, but from other incidents involving Barrett over the past few months. The evidence was painting a clear pattern. 3 similar stops in the past 2 weeks alone, one of the FBI agents reported, scrolling through the neighbor's footage. All involving professional people of color, all in this neighborhood, all without documented cause. David maintained his professional demeanor, but those who knew him well could see the controlled anger in his stance. "Officer Barrett, do you know what my division at the FBI specializes in?" He didn't wait for an answer. "We investigate civil rights violations, particularly those involving law enforcement. What you've done here tonight isn't just wrong, it's potentially criminal." The gathered crowd watched in silent satisfaction as Barrett's career essentially unraveled before their eyes. Captain Rivera was already on her phone, coordinating with internal affairs. 2 other officers were carefully taking down witness statements, their own expressions a mix of embarrassment and determination to do better. "I've seen too many cases like this," David continued, addressing not just Barrett but all the officers present. "They start with routine stops, with officers who think their badge gives them the right to act on their prejudices. They end with damaged lives, broken trust, and a community that sees law enforcement as a threat rather than protection." Andrea stepped forward, her surgical scrubs a reminder of her own professional standing. "Every day, I work with officers who bring injured children to my emergency room. I see their dedication, their professionalism, their genuine desire to protect and serve. What happened here tonight dishonors their service." The night air crackled with tension as Barrett finally seemed to grasp the full magnitude of his actions. His face had gone pale, his hands trembling slightly as he handed over his badge and gun to Captain Rivera, standard procedure for an officer being placed on immediate administrative leave. "This isn't the end," David announced, addressing the gathered crowd. "Starting tomorrow, my team will conduct a full review of all traffic stops in this district for the past year. We'll be looking for patterns, examining body camera footage, and interviewing community members. Real change requires real accountability." The neighbors began to disperse, but not before exchanging contact information with the FBI agents. Mrs. Thompson's daughter, the one whose life Andre had saved the previous year, had been watching from their front porch. She ran over to give her doctor a quick hug before her mother led her back home. As the official vehicles began to clear out, Barrett was escorted to a waiting supervisor's car. His career in law enforcement was effectively over, but more importantly, his actions had sparked a process that would reshape the entire department's approach to community policing. Andrea finally allowed herself to relax, leaning slightly against her husband. Not exactly the quiet evening I had planned, she said with a tired smile. David wrapped an arm around her shoulders, watching as the last police cars pulled away. Sometimes the most important changes start with one person standing their ground, he replied. You did everything right tonight. The street began to return to its usual peaceful state, but something fundamental had shifted in the neighborhood. Tomorrow would bring investigations, interviews, and the beginning of real institutional change. But for tonight, justice had been served in its own unique way, all because one officer picked the wrong person to profile on the wrong quiet suburban street. The following morning, the sun rose on a neighborhood forever changed. The police department's internal affairs office had been transformed into a hub of activity, with FBI agents and police investigators working side by side, reviewing years of dash cam footage and civilian complaints. Andrea sat across from Lieutenant Torres, providing her official statement. Her surgeon's precision came through as she recounted every detail of the previous night's events, her voice steady and clear. He made assumptions based solely on my appearance, she explained. Even when neighbors confirmed my identity, even when I offered to provide documentation, he chose escalation over reason. Down the hall, David and his FBI team had set up a temporary command center. Stacks of files covered the tables, years of traffic stop data, civilian complaints, and officer records. The pattern they were uncovering was impossible to ignore. Look at these numbers, Agent Wilson said, pointing to a spreadsheet. Barrett's stops in predominantly white neighborhoods almost exclusively targeted people of color. But his reports always cited suspicious behavior or routine checks as justification. Mrs. Thompson and other neighbors had been arriving all morning to provide their statements. The community's response was overwhelming. People brought video evidence, written accounts, and personal stories of encounters with Barrett that had never been officially reported. My son stopped driving his new car to work, one neighbor explained to the investigators. Started taking the bus instead, just to avoid another random stop. He's a bank manager, but that didn't matter to Officer Barrett. Captain Rivera, who had taken personal charge of the investigation, looked exhausted but determined. This goes beyond one officer's bias, she admitted, reviewing the mounting evidence. We had systems in place that should have caught this pattern months ago. The fact that they didn't points to deeper problems. Back in the conference room, Andre was finishing her statement when her phone buzzed. The hospital needed her for an emergency surgery. Even after all this, there are children who need my help, she said, standing to leave. That's what Officer Barrett couldn't see last night, that I'm just someone trying to do my job, trying to help people. David walked her to her car, both of them noting the news vans parked at the end of the street. The story had broken that morning, and media interest was growing. Are you sure you're okay to operate? He asked, concern evident in his voice. Andre smiled, her professional confidence shining through. In the operating room, nothing exists except the patient and the work that needs to be done. It's actually exactly what I need right now. Inside the station, the investigation continued to expand. Officer Rodriguez, who had attempted to de-escalate the situation the previous night, was providing valuable context about departmental culture. Some officers complained about Barrett's behavior, but there was no formal process for peer reporting. We need to change that. The police chief had called an emergency meeting with community leaders, acknowledging that the incident with Dr. Chen had exposed systemic issues that could no longer be ignored. Plans were already being drafted for new training programs, accountability measures, and community oversight committees. By late afternoon, the department's public affairs office had released its first statement. The actions witnessed last night do not reflect our values or our commitment to protecting all members of our community. We are taking immediate steps to address both this incident and the underlying issues it has revealed. The neighbor's video footage had gone viral, spreading across social media platforms and news websites. Comments poured in from across the country, many sharing similar experiences with law enforcement. What happened on that quiet suburban street was becoming a catalyst for a national conversation. Meanwhile, Barrett sat in his union representative's office, facing the reality of his actions. His personnel file now lay open, revealing a history of complaints that had been dismissed or downplayed. The union rep looked grim as he explained that this time there would be no defending his actions, not with FBI involvement and clear video evidence. As evening approached, Andre returned from her successful surgery to find their streets still buzzing with activity. FBI agents were going door to door, gathering additional statements. Local community organizers had set up an impromptu meeting in the park, discussing ways to turn this incident into lasting change. David met her in the driveway, case files in hand. "How was surgery?" he asked, helping her with her bag. "The patient will make a full recovery," she replied, watching the ongoing activity in their neighborhood. "Kind of like what's happening here. It's painful, it's complicated, but with the right intervention, healing is possible." The sun was setting on day one of what would become a watershed moment for the police department and the community. What started as one officer's biased traffic stop had cracked open a door that could no longer be closed, revealing issues that had festered in darkness for far too long. Change was coming, and this time it would be documented, monitored, and made to last. 1 week into the investigation, the police department's conference room looked like something out of a crime drama. Walls covered with maps showed traffic stop patterns, while computer screens displayed countless hours of dash cam footage. The truth they were uncovering was more disturbing than anyone had initially suspected. "Look at this," Agent Wilson said, pointing to a cluster of pins on the map. In the past year alone, Barrett conducted over 200 random stops in affluent neighborhoods. 90% of those stopped were professionals of color. Doctors, lawyers, business executives, all subjected to aggressive questioning about whether they belonged in their own neighborhoods. David stood at the front of the room, reviewing the latest findings with Captain Rivera. The investigation had expanded well beyond one officer's actions, revealing a deeper pattern of unchecked bias within the department. "The software we use for tracking complaints had a serious flaw," Officer Rodriguez explained, pulling up the department's database. If an officer marked a complaint as resolved, it disappeared from the system entirely. No record, no pattern tracking, nothing. Barrett knew this and used it to his advantage. In another room, Andre sat with a group of community members who had come forward with their stories. A young architect described being stopped 3 times in 1 month while driving home from late-night project meetings. A hospital administrator shared how she'd started taking different routes home to avoid certain patrol areas. "What strikes me," Andrea said, taking notes for the Community Action Committee she now led, "is how many of us changed our behavior to accommodate this harassment. We took different roads, changed our schedules, bought different cars, all to avoid drawing attention. That's not how anyone should have to live in their own community." The investigation had also uncovered something unexpected. Officers who had tried to report Barrett's behavior through proper channels, only to be stonewalled by an outdated system and departmental politics. "I filed 2 complaints about his conduct last year," Officer Lai admitted during his interview. "Both times, I was told to focus on my own patrol duties. There was this unwritten rule about not making waves, not questioning other officers' judgment." Captain Rivera had taken the findings directly to the police chief and city council. The presentation was brutal in its honesty. Years of biased policing, hidden by systematic failures and institutional inertia. "We're not just looking at one officer's misconduct," she explained to the council. "We're seeing the failure of our entire oversight system. Every time we ignored a complaint or dismissed a concern, we sent a message that this behavior was acceptable." The city council chambers were packed as community members shared their experiences. The architect who'd been repeatedly stopped brought his own analysis, a detailed map showing how Barrett's patrol patterns targeted specific demographics in affluent areas. He wasn't just profiling individuals, the architect explained, his professional expertise adding weight to his words. He was systematically patrolling routes and times when professionals of color would be most likely to be driving through these neighborhoods. Back at the station, David's team had uncovered something even more damaging. Evidence that Barrett had been sharing his techniques with younger officers during informal training sessions. He called it proactive community protection, a rookie officer admitted during his interview. "He taught us to look for what he called displacement indicators, basically anyone who he thought didn't match the neighborhood's demographics." The investigation was also revealing heroes, officers who had quietly helped targeted community members, trying to counteract Barrett's actions without directly confronting him. "I would warn people at community meetings," Officer Rodriguez shared. I couldn't be explicit, but I would suggest safer routes, times to avoid certain areas. It wasn't enough, but it was all I felt I could do within the system. As the second week of investigation began, the department announced its first wave of concrete changes. New software was being implemented to track complaint patterns. Body camera footage would be randomly audited by civilian oversight committees. Training programs were being completely revamped with input from community leaders. Andrea, returning from another long hospital shift, found David still working late, surrounded by case files and investigation reports. "You know what amazes me?" she said, looking at the evidence wall. "All of this was happening in plain sight. It just took one incident, one moment when someone had the power to demand accountability, to bring it all to light." David nodded, adding another pin to the map. "That's often how change happens. One person stands their ground, then another shares their story, and suddenly everyone finds the courage to speak up. The truth was always there, it just needed someone to listen." The investigation was far from over, but it had already achieved something remarkable. It had transformed a single incident of bias into a movement for systematic change, proving that sometimes the most powerful catalyst for reform is simply bringing hidden truths into the light. 6 months later, the community gathered in the City Hall's main conference room. The space was packed with residents, police officers, and media representatives, all there to witness the formal adoption of what had become known as the Chen Rivera reforms, named after the doctor whose experience sparked the changes and the captain who helped implement them. Andrea sat in the front row beside David, watching as Captain Rivera presented the final report. The changes went far beyond anyone's initial expectations. Barrett had been formally charged with civil rights violations, but his case had become just one part of a much larger transformation. "Today marks not just the end of an investigation," Captain Rivera announced, "but the beginning of a new era in community policing." The reforms we're implementing today were shaped by everyone in this room: citizens who shared their stories, officers who spoke up about needed changes, and community leaders who helped us rebuild trust. The new policies were comprehensive. Every traffic stop would now be reviewed by a civilian oversight committee. Officers would receive monthly training on bias recognition and prevention. A new digital system would track patterns in police interactions, making it impossible to hide discriminatory practices. But perhaps the most important change, Rivera continued, is in how we handle internal reporting. Officers who spot potential misconduct now have clear, protected channels to report their concerns. The blue wall of silence is being replaced by a culture of accountability. In the audience, Officer Rodriguez sat with several younger officers. She had been promoted to lead the department's new community relations unit, using her experience to help bridge the gap between law enforcement and residents. 6 months ago, she shared during her portion of the presentation, many of us felt helpless to stop what we knew was wrong. Today, we have the tools and support to ensure every member of our community is treated with respect and dignity. The changes weren't limited to one department. David stood to explain how the FBI was using their investigation as a model for other cities. "What happened here is being studied nationwide," he explained. "Other departments are already adopting similar reforms. Real change is possible when communities and law enforcement work together." Andrea had become a recognized voice for reform, speaking at police academies about her experience. But she always made sure to highlight the positive changes she'd witnessed. "Last week," she told the audience, "I was driving home late from an emergency surgery. A young officer pulled me over for a broken taillight. The difference in how that stop was handled, the professionalism, the respect, the clear explanation of why I was stopped, showed me how far we've come." The City Council presented their own findings. Traffic stop data from the past 6 months showed a dramatic decrease in discriminatory stops, while community satisfaction with police interactions had risen significantly. But numbers only tell part of the story, the council president noted. The real change is in how people feel in their own neighborhoods. Our residents no longer feel they have to change their routes or schedules to avoid harassment. Our officers report feeling more supported in doing their jobs correctly. Barrett's case had concluded the previous week. He had been convicted on multiple civil rights violations and was facing serious consequences. But as Andrea often pointed out in her speeches, the goal wasn't punishment, it was prevention. "We're not here to celebrate one person's downfall," she told reporters after the meeting. "We're here to celebrate the rise of a better system, one that protects both the community and the officers who serve it properly." The reforms had unexpected positive effects. Officer recruitment from minority communities increased. Community members were more willing to cooperate with police investigations. Crime reporting went up as trust improved. David wrapped up the presentation with a powerful observation. "6 months ago, my wife was treated like a criminal for driving home from saving lives. Today, that same drive represents something different, a community where protection and respect go hand in hand." As the meeting concluded, residents and officers mingled freely, sharing stories and ideas for further improvements. The atmosphere was one of cautious optimism, tempered by the understanding that maintaining these changes would require ongoing commitment from everyone involved. Andre and David walked home together, passing the spot where everything had started. A new community police substation had opened nearby, its windows decorated with children's artwork, a visible symbol of the changing relationship between law enforcement and residents. "You know what makes me proudest?" Andre said, pausing to look at the station. "It's not just that we changed things. It's that we showed others how to change too. Every city that adopts these reforms, every department that improves its training, that's part of our story now." The streetlight above them flickered on as evening settled in. The same light that had illuminated a moment of injustice now shone on a community transformed. It wasn't a perfect ending. Real change never is. But it was a powerful beginning, proof that when people stand up for what's right, the ripples of their actions can transform entire communities.